Hi, this is Steve back at the Listening to Post, and today we're going to take a trip back to the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles and talk about the third album by the band called Love. That's Forever Changes. This album came out in late 1967, was finally released in November of 1967. Love were one of the top live acts in Los Angeles back in the heyday of the Sunset Strip, behind the Byrds. And I've always found it interesting that the bands in Los Angeles that played the Sunset Strip never really got the recognition that the San Francisco bands coming out of Haight-Ashbury got. The scene in Los Angeles took off about a year before the scene in San Francisco, but you just don't hear people talk about the LA bands in the same light. Perhaps part of the reason is they were still basically copying the style of the Beatles, and later when the San Francisco bands emerged, under the influence of heavy drugs, they developed their own much more unique style. And one of the other reasons may have been that the clubs in Los Angeles were much smaller than the clubs in San Francisco. I've been able to get to a couple of the clubs in LA, the Whiskey A Go Go, the Viper Room, the Troubadour, all in West Hollywood. And they're really tiny little places, considering how historic they are. They're really small clubs. But the one thing, you always know you're in LA when a club has $1 million sound system. So they're going to sound good regardless. But the Fillmore and the Family Dog up in San Francisco were much larger auditoriums, and that may have also contributed to the success of those San Francisco bands. They did open a club in Los Angeles called the Kaleidoscope. I believe Canned Heat recorded a live album there, and that was in an attempt to mimic somewhat the clubs in San Francisco that were drawing the larger crowds. Another problem was the riots on Sunset Strip. In 1966, a lot of the shop owners and merchants in West Hollywood started complaining to the city council about the large crowds of young people attending these rock shows, and the city council imposed a 10 p.m. curfew that basically put a lot of those clubs out of business, and that led to the rioting that the Sunset Strip is so well known for. But Love was one of the top acts from 1966 to 1967. They released 3 albums. Their first album came out in 1966, and it had a minor hit on it called My Little Red Book, which was actually a Burt Bacharach, Hal David composition. It's a great album. If you're into 1960s garage rock, little bit of a punk vibe to it. And the difference between garage rock and punk rock, I think, is as much to do with fashion as anything else. But that first album by Love is well worth seeking out if you like 60s garage rock. They released a second album in the beginning of 1967 called Da Capo, and then they released Forever Changes in November of 1967. I have this right here, and if you look at the cover, that's the faces of the band members, but it's meant to represent an organic heart. And the name Forever Changes comes from a conversation the leader of Love, Arthur Lee, overheard. A girlfriend, after a breakup, told her boyfriend, "You said you would love me forever," and he said, "Yeah, well, forever changes." And according to Arthur Lee, the full title of the album is Love Forever Changes. This album was a departure from the previous 2 records, which were more folk rock based. This album's much more acoustic, and he's brought in a orchestral backing on many of the tracks, and also some horns on many of the tracks. The producer, Bruce Botnick, worked with Herb Alpert in the Tijuana Brass. And so some of the songs, like the opening track, Alone Again Or, and the closing track, You Set the Scene, both have mariachi trumpets on them, courtesy of Bruce Botnick's association with Herb Alpert. The second songwriter in the group, Bryan MacLean, contributed a song called Old Man, and he also wrote the opening track, Alone Again Or. His title for that song was Alone Again, and Arthur Lee added Or, Alone Again Or. Bryan MacLean also wrote a song on the previous album, Da Capo, called Orange Skies, and on the first album he wrote a song called Softly to Me. Bryan MacLean wrote quite a few songs that were never recorded by Love, and Sundazed Records has released all his demo recordings in a compilation that, if you're interested, is worth seeking out. The other star of this album is actually the arranger, David Angel. He came in with the LA Symphony Orchestra and worked with Arthur Lee to enhance many of these songs. This album only reached number 154 on the charts, even though it's now considered a classic from the psychedelic era. One of the problems was the band didn't tour. They had all but broken up by the time they got together in the studio to make this album. And the producer, Bruce Botnick, brought in a group of session musicians that worked in LA called the Wrecking Crew. And there's a documentary out about the Wrecking Crew. They worked with the Beach Boys and many of the Monkees, many of the groups out of Los Angeles in the 60s. If they weren't really ready to work in a studio, the producers would bring in the Wrecking Crew. Leon Russell, the famous rock pianist, was a member of the Wrecking Crew. Glenn Campbell was a member of the Wrecking Crew. And they recorded 2 songs on this album. They recorded And More Again, which definitely had potential for being a hit song. And they also recorded a song called Daily Planet. And that was arranged by Neil Young. Originally, Neil Young was going to produce this album. He was taking a break from Buffalo Springfield, but he realized at the last minute it was going to be a bit more to take on than he was ready for at the time, so he backed out. Let's see, anything else? I think that might be about it. Definitely worth seeking out. This record was named 40th on Rolling Stone's list of all-time greatest albums. It was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2008. It was added to the National Registry in 2012. After this album came out, like I said, the group had all but broken up and did not tour to support it. It only reached number 154 on the charts. Bryan MacLean quit the group soon after this came out, and Arthur Lee pretty much dismissed the rest of the band. Arthur Lee, by the way, this album was released on Elektra Records. Arthur Lee was the one that recommended The Doors to Elektra Records. The Doors were not a big live act prior to releasing their first album. They played the smaller clubs in LA and only had a small cult following. Arthur Lee actually was the one that recommended them to Elektra and helped them get their first contract. Arthur Lee continued to record as Love with different musicians, and they did release a couple more albums. For Sale came out in 1969, and Out Here and False Start came out soon after, but they didn't do too well, and he fell on hard times. Eventually ended up in prison for several years under California's 3 strikes law. He was found guilty of domestic abuse after a fight with his girlfriend. Then after a fight with a neighbor, he shot a gun up into the air and was arrested for that and sent to prison. He served in prison for about 6 years. By the time he got out, this album had received the recognition that it justly deserved, and Arthur Lee reformed a band and went on tour to support this album. Then he was diagnosed with leukemia, and I believe he passed away around 2006. Bryan MacLean died in 1998. He had a heart attack. And also the bassist for the band, Ken Forsey, died in 1998. Well, that's about all I've got on this. Definitely worth seeking out. It's a good listen, and that's what we're all about here at the Listening Post. Once again, this essay is available on the Totally Guitars website, totallyguitars.com/the Listening Post. And I've enjoyed speaking with you. We look forward to seeing you again next time.